The investigation into Colin's death is supposed to be treated as homicide. Unfortunately, it's just the same bias and misrepresentation. On Monday the 6th of July 2009, Candice Bonner was detained on suspicion of murder. Previously on Friday the 3rd of July, a police officer was instructed to go to GLENROTHES police station on the Monday morning. The officer arrived at the office and was informed that they were part of a team to pick up Candice Bonner. They drove to the Forth Road Bridge and waited on the approach road, and within seconds Candice drove past. They followed and eventually arrested her near her aunt's home in Ballingray. This is precision timing, considering it was planned on the Friday. Before we briefly cover the interview of Candice, there is a point of note. At this point, her mother and father had still not been interviewed, and her aunt and uncle had still refused to be interviewed. They were important people in terms of trying to understand what happened that night. The interviewing of Candice commenced at 9:15 AM that morning and was led by the senior investigating officer and a detective sergeant. Our key focus on looking at this interview is the way in which the SIO carries out the questioning. It seems surprising that the SIO actually asked Candice about the call she made to Colin's brother on the night of Colin's death, considering it is actually never recorded on the situation reports. Candice gave her own comprehensive response as to why she called Colin's brother that evening, and there was conflict between the two accounts. In fact, there was conflict with previous accounts. It seems clear that the SIO wanted to avoid asking for clarification by providing the final comment on the matter. We see another question raised that wasn't on the situation reports that were shared with the experts. In this one, the SIO asked Candice about clothes on the bed and a half-packed suitcase. She just answers no. Were you aware of the clothes in the bed? No. She's not actually asked to identify the clothes. Considering they had photographs, surely she could identify any clothes that were in that room. But it was never asked. In fact, no witness was ever asked to identify the clothes on the bed. The last example we'll bring up is the question of Colin self-harming. We can see that Candice is asked about this, and she says that he doesn't do it. The SIO doesn't ask Candice if she's sure that Colin hasn't self-harmed before. He actually tells her how important self-harming and previous self-harming fits in with self-infliction. By the SIO stating the important linkage of self-harm to self-infliction corrupts this question. Is the answer given genuinely from recall or a need to help support the previous assertions made on the night of Colin's death? There are other moments in the interview where the SIO leads Candice to answers he seems to want, all away from Candice or towards Colin. How bad was this interview? It's best explained by Tony Whittle.
The basic model says you get their account, you don't interrupt, you let them tell the story, let them tell as many lies as they like. If that's what they want to do, let them lie like Billy O. You've got it all on tape, it's all on video. You then identify the areas you want to go back to, the topic areas. So you say, well, the first thing is, you said that it was, when you went into the house, he hadn't eaten for days, it looked awful, it was depressed, and you do the who, what, where, why, and when. You probe that area. And then you'd say, well, you said in your first statement, when you got there, it was absolutely fine. In your second statement, you say, it seemed a bit down. And in your third interview, suddenly, he's suicidal. Now, Candice, come on now. And that kind of questioning should have taken place, but it didn't. And you would go through each topic, because you've captured her account, she can't change that. And you would tell her, say, what you said is not consistent with this and this, and this. What's your explanation to that? None of that was done. Now, that is such basic principle investigative techniques that any detective inspector would know what they are and didn't do it. And I think that was a choice not to do it rather than lack of knowledge of how to do it.
So what do we take from this? It does appear that there was a comprehensive interview strategy. The questions asked are very pertinent to what was actually collected in the police statements as opposed to the police situation reports. And, if we had any doubt, the Fiscal's office clearly knows that a significant discrepancy exists between actual statements and police situation reports. and yet they still support the sending of these corrupt reports to experts. Once again, it's clear that Fife Police are determined not to challenge Candice on anything that may be detrimental to their position. And surely, this must mean that at the very least, individuals within the Fiscal's office are complicit. So who in the Fiscal's office reviewed this interview? So what conclusion can we draw? If we consider that July 2007 interview was just laying down her version of events, the two opportunities to truly scrutinise this, May 2008 and July 2009, falls way below what would be expected in a criminal investigation. The extent to which this subversion occurs can only come about through deliberate acts, but how far does any complicity go? It must also be stressed that these failures are driven by police and have little to do with Candice. We had previously highlighted, through Tony Whittle, the importance of police not allowing suspects insight into investigation possibilities. And yet here we are, with the Candice being interviewed and a number of our family members either refusing or not being interviewed at this stage. And yet the SIO divulges that he's got concern over the uncle not giving a statement and about the clothes on the bed. An outcome of this is that some months later, a member of Candice's family appeared to give some kind of explanation for these two issues. This appeared to be unsolicited input, and this is topics that no other witness was questioned about. On the 28th of July 2009, we had our first meeting with the Fiscal following Candice's arrest earlier that month. A slight concern has arisen over the minutes. Normally these were made available within a few days of the original meeting, but in this case we still hadn't received them a full month later. There was actually very little feedback on the actual interview. They gave the impression that Candice had been thoroughly challenged in this interview and she still had not changed her position, and that they had been part of the interview strategy. The disparity between what we now know happened in that interview and what we are told here is remarkable. The most obvious question that arises from this is to ask if these fiscal officials ever actually viewed this interview, or are we again just taking a Fife Police narrative? Just like in February 2008, it would be essential to understand what documentation flowed between the Fiscal's office and Fife Police at this stage. Meeting with the Fiscal then went on to discuss fingerprints. In the background, we had been pushing for more information on fingerprints for quite some time, and we wanted to understand if the handle of the knife was fingerprintable. We knew that there was one partial print on the knife handle, and we knew that this wasn't Candice's, but was the print consistent with what actually happened that night? Typically, prints found in a domestic fatality have very little legal merit, as both parties could have handled the knife at any time. What was of interest, though, was not so much who handled the knife, but were any prints consistent with events that night. We know that without doubt that whoever caused the stabbing that night would have used great force, and according to Professor Busuttil, would have been perspiring heavily, and a clear sign the knife had been gripped should be visible. According to Professors Busuttil and Green, the force required to remove the knife would be greater, so again there should be clear signs. We know that COLIN can leave prints, and we know that the knife handle should rarely take fingerprints, and yet on the handle all we have is the flimsiest partial fingerprint. There were clear signs the knife had been held elsewhere. While there was no identifiable prints on the blade, there would have been DNA. The authorities destroyed this, trying to get a good image of the print on the handle. We had been taking advice on this matter from an esteemed fingerprint professional and expert in rib pressure evaluation. This is a method to assess the kind of pressure used to grip an item. Our request for the Fiscal to use him was refused. We go into this next meeting on 24th of August 2009, once again with no minutes, but now from the previous two meetings. Some of the feedback we were receiving was quite unbelievable. We were informed that both Professors Green and Busuttil had reduced their opinion based upon the discussion they had with the Depute Fiscal. It was again reiterated that Candice was challenged in the last interview and there was no major inconsistencies. Colin's mother had stated she felt that she was being bypassed by Fife Police, and Colin's father had said that Fife Police were coming to him for answers to things that Colin's mother would obviously be the best source. We also see that the Scottish Police Service Authority stating that they had expected to see fingerprints on the knife handle. Yet in this case the Fiscal is unconcerned, or deliberately bypassing a significant concern. With the lack of communication updates, the changing of expert views and the lack of concern for genuine evidential conflict, there was only one place this was being driven. We were told that there's still plans to have a computer-aided simulation of events, and that Fife Police were having their investigation reviewed by Dundee Police, We believe that this latter action was to satisfy Article 2 and that there had been a degree of impartiality and independence. It tells us that the investigation is over, and this action is because of us challenging them on Article 2. On the 2nd of September 2009, our concerns over the lack of impartiality saw us write to the Scottish Justice Minister. The reply was to become a standard from government. They could not get involved. Probably the most important thing that we did was call Professor Busuttil. The feedback from Fiscal Depute that in conversation he had reduced his opinion did not seem consistent with any dialogue we had previously had with the Professor. With our severe lack of trust in this investigation, it was essential that we knew if the Professor had genuinely reduced his opinion. His unequivocal response was that he had not changed his opinion. As we entered into the next Fiscals meeting, we were obviously focused on Professor Busuttil's opinion, but we were really concerned over the lack of minutes from previous meetings, so we actually started recording the meetings. When we brought up that Professor Busuttil had not changed his opinion, the chief concern seemed to lie with being caught out rather than the serious question of misrepresentation of a key witness. Although we had successfully stopped the misrepresentation of Professor Busuttil's opinion, they will succeed later by supplying manipulated evidence. They still had the problem that Professor Green had corroborated the opinion of Professor Busuttil, but was still being regarded as having been misled by Colin's family. He was never actually asked to clarify his source until at the FBI, and in fact it was the police themselves through their reports that he was using. We were now deeply concerned by the role and behaviour of the Fiscal Depute. This individual was pushing the idea of the sternum cut from the side, based upon his own research. This was before talking with the author of the postmortem, who it is then stated was in agreement. This is then shared with all experts. We will see later that this is a significant issue that rears its head again in the Strathclyde investigation. In the background of our meetings, the Fiscal and police asked for a toxicology report to look at the effects of cocaine, bearing in mind that all the police knew was that Colin occasionally used drugs on a social basis. They had no idea of the frequency of his drug taking, no idea of the quantity, and they have no idea when he started. The toxicology report was ordered on the basis of Colin being a regular abuser of cocaine. We did not see this report until the FBI. This was an extreme fabrication by Fife Police, and it looks like the Fiscal participated. Colin being seen as a drug abuser was completely dismissed by the Strathclyde investigation a few years later. There was no evidence that Colin abused drugs. Prior to our next Fiscals meeting on the 2nd of October, Colin's father had actually a meeting with the Fiscal 2 days earlier on the 30th September. The difference in information was startling. We see that on the Wednesday the 30th of September, the Fiscal had a view of the psychological report, and in fact gave Colin's father insights into its contents. Yet by the Friday, Colin's mother is told the report had only arrived on the Thursday the previous night and had not been viewed yet. We see that Colin's father is informed that the act was never meant as suicidal, but a dramatic gesture. We're now moving into the hand of God scenarios. Interestingly, he is informed that the author of the report did not know it was Colin's print on the knife. Well, he shouldn't, as no one knew whose print was on the knife. When we reviewed this report, we saw that the author of the report had received a call from the Fiscal's office informing him that the print on the knife was Colin's. This was referenced 5 times within the report, and seemed to play a large part in the final decision making. It is clearly bad enough to have lied to Colin's father about the fingerprint, but it was not true that the fingerprint was definitely Colin's. They actually had no record of Colin's prints, and this was an exercise in elimination, and there were still a number of people still to be fingerprinted. The psychological assessment of Colin and Candice is essentially based upon the police investigation. We find that there are a number of false factors pointing at Colin within the report. Now we see not only had Colin supposed to have a drug problem, but financial as well. This is despite the police own report stated that the finances were unremarkable. There is talk of a friend of Colin's committing suicide, and this is seen as a factor for others to commit suicide. And yet when we talk to this young man's family, we are informed that not only was Colin not a friend, he did not die through suicide. What we're seeing here is the same corrupt information being used to bias the expert opinions. What was the eventual purpose of this report? We believe that because Colin's father had attended on his own on this occasion, there was a clear attempt to influence Colin's father into believing that self-infliction was most likely, and thus drive a wedge between him and Colin's mother's position. What they didn't know was that Colin's father had shared this information with Colin's mother. This report was also given to Professor Busuttil, and he did state at the FAI that it was part of the reason why he had reduced his opinion. Colin's mother attempted to get access to this report, but was informed she could not because it failed to meet the legal standards of evidence and was being withdrawn. It must be remembered, however, that Professor Busuttil was influenced by this report, and the Fiscal did not enlighten him to this change. So why was the Fiscal's office scared of letting Colin's family see the actual report? Notwithstanding the many corrupt facts shared with this professional, we also see issues highlighted that have constantly been denied by Fife Police, and maybe the comment that has the greatest significance is one very similar to that stated by ex-head of CID Tony Whittle. It states that there are clear and serious inconsistencies in Ms Bonner's 3 witness statements. The investigation is being drawn to a close, but it's maybe best left with what the Fiscal actually said on the 24th of August. It said there was no major inconsistencies in Candice Bonner's interview. Not everyone can be wrong. Despite being told repeatedly that no stone would be left unturned, we find that even beyond corrupt inputs and suppression of findings, that almost any single thing that could challenge Candice Bonner's account has been avoided.